Tonight, miracle on the Hudson. A jetliner filled with passengers crashes in the frigid waters off Manhattan, and everyone on board survives.
US Airways Flight 1549 had just taken off from LaGuardia Airport in Queens for Charlotte, North Carolina, when it apparently hit a flock of birds, knocking out both of the plane's engines.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it. We're going to be in the Hudson.
Even without power, though, the pilots managed to maneuver the Airbus A320 northward over the Bronx, make a sharp turn south, then follow the Hudson River alongside Manhattan Island, losing altitude along the way, and finally coming to rest on the river.
The plane then skimmed across the water 100 yards or more before coming to a rest just off Midtown Manhattan.
Many passengers didn't think they'd make it. One man turned his cell phone on so his body could be found through the phone's GPS. A woman left a message for her husband. Tell the kids I love them.
Joining me now is Dave Sanderson. He was one of the last passengers out of the plane. I understand you were actually in the plane after it landed for 7 minutes. Was it filling up with water?
Yeah, once we got everybody out, I stood in the plane to make sure everybody was out. And it was filling up pretty rapidly, and it got up to about waist level. And then when everybody was out in the lifeboats, I then stepped out on the edge there, and it was about knee deep at that point, and I just jumped in and started trying to swim to the first boat I could find.
Chesley B. Sullenberger III, a former fighter pilot, used 40 years of experience to somehow land the powerless plane on the icy waters of the Hudson River, a feat that's being called a miracle.
David, take me inside the plane. Take me inside as this plane impacts on the water. What was going on inside?
It was stone quiet in there, which was amazing to me, because I don't think anybody cross-referenced what was going on. And I think that was a saving grace. And I just want to say, I admire your skills. I honor the way you managed your state. And now I do listen to the flight attendants every flight. Yeah. I know exactly where everything is. Yes. I know exactly where the exits are. And I know where that life preserver is.
I'm really proud of a dear, dear friend of mine by the name of Dave Sanderson. Every one of us got a hero inside. Every one of us has a capacity in the most difficult times to find our strength. And it's nice to see a miracle on the Hudson and know that part of that miracle was an extraordinary pilot, and another part of that was a dear friend who, even when he could barely function, made sure other people's lives were being saved and supported.
How you doing, everyone? So I just finished recording this week's episode of Beyond Impact, and you guys are not going to want to miss this. I had the privilege of interviewing Dave Sanderson. Now, Dave was the last passenger off the flight that crashed into the Hudson River back in January of 2009. And if you remember this was a flight that had a bird strike after it took off from LaGuardia Airport. And there was a movie that was made about this, Captain Sullenberg, which was played by he was played by Tom Hanks in the movie Sully. Definitely check out the movie. I would highly recommend it. But this episode of Beyond Impact, Dave was again the last passenger off the plane that day. And what was incredible about his story was that he was sitting in row 15, and he wasn't even supposed to be on that flight that day. He was working for Oracle at the time. He was in sales. He was also Tony Robbins' head of security. And so he was traveling around. He'd been around Tony Robbins for a bit, hearing some of the principles and the inspiration and motivation that Tony had talked about. And Dave had always had some aspirations for doing something that was important and impactful. And on that fateful day, this was the day that really changed Dave's life. And through this podcast, we talk about the experience of him landing in the Hudson that day and what it was like to make sure that all the passengers were off the plane. He was, again, the last passenger off the plane, and what it was like to be rescued out of the frigid waters of that morning. And then some of the mindset principles that helped him navigate and get through that horrific experience of not knowing if you're going to live in a plane crash. He said 60 seconds before they hit the water, that's when Sully got on the plane intercom and said, "This is your captain speaking, brace for impact." And I can't even imagine being in that situation, but Dave talks about that in pretty amazing detail, and what he gained from this experience and how he's transformed this experience into his own speaking career and the impact that he's making in the world. He talks about the 4 freedoms that he was lacking up until that point, and how he realized these are the 4 important freedoms of time, money, mission, and relationship. So in the podcast, we touch on that. We talk about some of the things that he's learned from his 1,800 stage appearances, and over the past few years, how he's evolved his message from when he first got up on the stage as someone who wasn't necessarily wanting to be the center of attention, but some of the things that his mom instilled in him in terms of, and I find this really powerful, from transforming the word or the phrase "I can't" to "I must." And throughout the talk, you're going to hear some of the things that have inspired him and supported him, and now moving into this amazing mission that he has to make an impact in the world, and how he's incorporated post-traumatic growth syndrome into what he talks about in terms of taking these traumatic experiences in life and turning them into a positive, impactful way to tap into your purpose. And a lot of the times it's the things that we feel are the worst experiences in our life that have the opportunity to actually be the things that define who we are and define our purpose. And I'm really excited about you guys listening to this episode. Now, a little bit as we start into the episode, the power in Dave's house went out. So you may notice that it looks a little bit different from when we start to the rest of the podcast, but don't worry about that. Again, it's all about the content. You don't have to be perfect with your message if you are looking to get up on stages or start your own podcast. This is just another example of, it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to have it all figured out. What's important is just having a connection to what it is that you care about. And my mission here with Beyond Impact is all about creating inspiring and impactful content to support you in being able to share your message with the world. So if you're interested in getting help with that, I can help you with that. Dave can help you with that. So no matter where you're at, don't feel that you have to stay stuck. There's so many different ways to get support and to get help. And through this podcast, you'll hear the importance of just talking about some of the things that you've been through that can help alleviate some of the stress and some of the anxiety. And then we're going to be in the podcast, we talk about what is the meaning that you associate some of these things. And it's the meaning that we associate with these experiences in life that can make all the difference in the world. So stay tuned for this amazing episode. Thanks for tuning in. And if you like what you hear here, please click on the subscribe button, because it allows me to be able to invite more amazing guests and to impact more people out there like yourself. So stay tuned and enjoy. And please put your hands together for Mr. Dave Sanderson. How you doing, Dave?
Good morning, Colin. How are you doing today?
I'm doing excellent. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me today. I'm excited to be here with you.
Well, I appreciate it. So let's jump right into it. I mean, on that day, I remember I was in New York City myself. It was January 15th, right? 2009?
That's correct.
Can you share with us just from not just that day, but a little bit about your life leading up to that day and how that day truly impacted your life in so many extraordinary ways?
Well, thank you very much for asking me. I'm very honored to be here today and be able to share a little bit about that day and that experience. It's the background is that I was in sales for a company by the name of Oracle, and I was working in primarily responsibility for what's called the consumer packaged goods area division in the Southeast. So we were at the end of a 3-day business trip. I traveled all the time, over 100,000 miles a year, like most salespeople do. And I was at the end of a 3-day business trip, which started in Sarasota, Florida. And then we went to Petersburg, Virginia to work in a manufacturing plant. And then we headed north that afternoon to New York City because we were going to be working in a distribution center in Brooklyn, New York the next day. Now, I don't know if anybody here has ever been or worked inside of a distribution center, but they always open up very early because trucks have to get going early. And we were doing actually systems checks, technology checks is what we do to be able to set up systems for people. And so we went in early, just like everybody else. You want to see how this whole thing was put together. So we went in around 5 o'clock in the morning to see how the trucks ran. I mean, the trucks get done usually about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning, and then they start their next day cycle. So we got done about 10 o'clock. And so I was excited because I got to go home early that day. I was in a 3-day business trip and like, let's go home, right? And I called our travel agent and worked with her, and she put me on flight 1549. I was scheduled to be on the 5 o'clock flight in a first class seat, which I gave up to get on the seat 15A on 1549 on January 15th.
Wow.
So it was 15 sort of runs with me the entire day. But like you said, it was a cold day in New York. It was 11 degrees that day. It's snowing. But, you're in New York. That's no big deal. It's the middle of the winter. So, I mean, that's not a big deal, right? And so the flights were delayed, which is not, once again, not unusual for LaGuardia. So nothing big about that. So, I was one of the first people to board the plane because of my status, because I flew so often. And so I went back to my seat and just did not pay attention. I tell people this is one of the biggest lessons out of this day. I didn't pay attention because I thought I knew everything, right? I know where the exits are, right? I didn't read the brochure. I didn't pay attention to flight attendants. I was heads down in my magazine, which like most people were.
Exactly.
Doing something else. So it's one of the big lessons is you got to pay attention. But I didn't. Nothing unusual about the takeoff. And if anybody here has ever been on LaGuardia, you know how it takes off over the bay and then sort of heads north and they start making their turns. That's no big deal. But as you mentioned, about 60 seconds into the flight is when I heard an explosion. And I never heard an explosion on a plane before. So I got my attention. So I looked up and looked out the window. I saw fire coming out beneath the left wing. So I knew something had happened, but hey, things happen on planes all the time, right? We lost an engine. We got another engine. No big deal. We'll head back to the airport. I'm not getting home early today. But, no one knew at that moment that both engines went out at the same moment, the same exact second. It was a double bird strike, knocking out both engines at the same exact second. So as you said, the plane became incapacitated and had no power whatsoever. And now we're sort of, he makes a big turn and I thought we'd go back to the airport, but all of a sudden I looked out my window and all of a sudden you see you're lower than the higher buildings in New York. Because if you've never been in New York, those buildings are extremely high. The skyscrapers are high. Oh, yeah. We were below the highest skyscraper. So it's like that got my attention. Like I've never seen this before, right? I mean, if you're lower than the skyscrapers, and then all of a sudden you see this bridge coming up, you're like, I've never seen that before. And all of a sudden you hear the captain's famous words, "This is your captain, brace for impact." And that's the moment you knew something serious was happening because all you saw in front of you was water and you're going pretty much head first into the water. So that's the moment where I think everybody, including me, was like checking in. Some people were checking in by way of making phone calls. Some people were texting, but me, I checked in with the big guy up top because I didn't want anything between me and him at that point. We were going down. I want to go up, and it's not looking good at this moment.
So didn't. So after the bird strike, after the explosion, there was really no communication from Sully to let you guys know what was going on. It was just brace for impact. And then how soon after that when you actually hit the water?
So he says, "This is your captain, brace for impact." And approximately 60 seconds later is when we crashed into the river. And
what was going through your head at that moment? I mean, I can't even imagine.
I didn't have any fear because I knew that I was either going to go to a better place or go home. One of the other is going to happen. But one of the things in my background, I was head of security for a gentleman named Tony Robbins, and being with Tony all these years, and especially as close as I was as head of security, I got ingrained on how to really manage my state, how to manage my mind. So I know there's three ways to do that, right? There's one, you can change your physiology, and I can get up and move around. You can change what you focus on, and that's what the captain had to do. He had to focus. So the way I did mine is I actually ask myself questions, and the question I kept asking myself is, what am I going to do if we get down? And what came to me is aisle up out. So the way I managed my mind in that last 60 seconds is to say to myself, aisle up out, aisle up out, aisle up out. So if we survived the plane crash, I had a game plan.
So you were working for Tony Robbins, and I have had the privilege of going to one of his seminars, Unleash the Power Within. So were you actually going to these seminars with him and making sure that just while you were there, as his head of security, you were able to listen to a lot of the things he was talking about during these seminars, correct?
That's correct. I had over 15 years with him, before my head of security opportunity and after and before. And, one of the things I also had the opportunity is be with him by himself so I could get inside his head a little bit about some of the things he was teaching, right? Which I think I got those distinctions that, people would love to have and understand because I had that proximity. And one of the things I talk about, and he talks about, as you probably know, is proximity is power. So anytime you have the opportunity to be around somebody of influence and a master, you take advantage of it. And fortunately, I had that opportunity.
Especially when he charges like $100,000 per day to work with him?
I think it's more like $1 million. I think it's more like $1 million a day.
Is
So
it?
yeah, so if you want to pay 100,000, you get 100,000.
Now it's $1 million. Okay.
I take it. I take it if I were you.
So from your proximity to Tony Robbins, and this is something that you talk about in your TED Talk, and I would highly recommend everyone here to check out Dave's TED Talk. There's four sides to there's 3 sides on the triangle, where each of the sides of the triangle represents 3 different concepts that you present. Tell us about what are the different sides of that triangle.
So yes, thank you. So the left side of the triangle, you start with physiology, because the way you move your body changes the way you think immediately. I mean, I give you an example, like a batter, right? Someone's a batter and they're walking around a little bit, then all of a sudden they're pulling their shirt. That's physiology changing to get them mentally ready to be able to face a Clayton Kershaw. The other side of the triangle is what's called internal dialogue, how you talk to yourself. And that's what I used that day on Miracle on the Hudson. I had to actually ask myself different questions to keep my mind focused, because I couldn't get up and move around. And the bottom of the triangle, which connects both of them, is called focus. And that's exactly what the captain had to use that day. He couldn't get around and move. He didn't have time to ask questions. He had to focus in. So anytime you get a situation where you're in a challenging situation, or you have to be on stage to be able to rock it, you have to be able to manage your state and be able to do all 3 of one, if not all 3.
Now, I've experienced this where, I ended up in my acting classes. It wasn't something I necessarily thought this acting career was going to be my profession. And from my acting classes led me to working on some of the, the biggest stages in the world. And then once I started to become more comfortable in my own skin, being able to be in front of audiences and overcoming my own fear of public speaking, a lot of what I learned in my acting classes, I realized started to be able to serve me when I wanted to write my book and started getting up on stages and doing some of my own speaking. I was always inspired by Tony Robbins. But I think what happened was during COVID, after I was supposed to be going on my book tour, and that shut that down, and then I started to turn everything online, I started to realize all the experiences and the training that I had accumulated in my life up until that COVID period, I realized was now finally all coming together in a way that I had no idea was going to lead into podcasting. And now I do, quite a bit of speaking on stages, and it's something that I always was inspired to do, watching Tony Robbins up on that stage. Yep. But I had those doubts, or those negative thoughts, thinking like, well, who am I to think that I could get up in front of a stage, and who would want to listen to me? And it sounds like, from listening to your TED Talk, up until that moment in your life, before that plane landed in the Hudson River, tell us a little bit about where you were at in terms of your career and feeling. If I recall correctly, it sounded like you were just maybe not fully connected to your purpose in life, and feeling a little stuck or stale, if I'm not putting incorrect words in your mouth. And then that moment was the moment that really helped you connect to your purpose and to be able to do all these amazing things. Can you share a little bit about some of your life before the plane crash, and then, without even realizing it, how this experience really impacted your ability to take that and turn it into all the amazing things that you're doing now?
Well, thank you. Yeah, I thank you. At that point in time, 25 years, I was in sales. I worked for maybe four companies by that time in different sales roles. And, it was all about, making money to make sure your family was supported. That was the mindset. And, what's interesting, a couple of my daughters were like laughing when I told them this. And I said, you got to understand, well, I grew up in the 60s. My dad grew up in a depression. And his model of the world was the father goes out and takes care of the company business. Mom stays home and takes care of the family. So that was sort of the model of the world that I grew up with. My mom did the same thing. So that was my focus. So I was driven. And at the same time, I needed to have some juice and improve myself. So that's why I started going through self development kind of programs. And that started for me way back in 1989. My first mentor's name was Bill, and he came into my life in 1983, and he was 77 years old then. He was a multimillionaire. And he brought me on as a mentor to me. And one of the first things he told me, Colin, was you have to keep investing in yourself. No one else is going to invest in you. You have to invest in yourself first. So he was the one that drove me to go to people like Jim Rohn and Tom Hopkins and Dennis Waitley and Tony Robbins. I was paying all this money. My wife thought I was crazy. I mean, what are you doing? You know, you go to all these places, you got a family to support,
Sure.
But, she now sees several years later that was the investment that everybody you need to make to be able to do what you need to do in life and fulfill your mission. So, yeah, but, you get to a point where, you show up, you're pretty good at what you do, right? And so, I knew I was going to make some money, right? I could make as much or little as the money I wanted because of the effort I put into it. And there was a point where, 2009, if you look at that year, it was a recession year.
Yeah.
It was a financial crisis. So there's and the time of this happened was January 15th, 5 days before the inauguration of a new president. So there was a lot of turmoil, right? I mean, there's a lot of things going on. So, people think that day was the day it started the mission. It really wasn't that day. It was actually the next day. And people say, well, what do you mean? You went through a plane crash. Well, yeah, the story is, I was the last passenger off the plane. I was one of the two people who spent the night in the hospital. I had severe hypothermia. So I spent the night in the hospital. And the next day, I negotiated my way to get back home because they did not want to release me. But I told them I got home, I immediately go to the doctor and make sure I got checked in. I did not do that, but that's what I negotiated. But to that night in the hospital, the only person that called me, Colin, was Tony Robbins.
Really?
My company didn't call me to check in. My company didn't even call my wife.
That's crazy.
So, when I got back home and after all the media stuff, I was doing media, you could probably tell, right? You were, in that situation, I was doing media all over the world. So when I was ready to go home and, we got in the car with two of my kids, I said, I'm going to stop by the office. I don't even know they knew I was in a plane crash. So we went by the office, which is about 2-3 miles from the airport. And I just told them, I said, hey, I just want to let you know I'm checking in. I survived. And my manager's first question was, you're going to Michigan next week, right?
That's crazy.
And two of my kids are looking at me like, Dad, what are you going to do? And I ultimately said yes, because that was the moment when the mission started coming together. The mission was actually started in 1997, but that's when the mission started coming together. And that's when I realized, this is where one of the things I talk about now on stage and teach when I coach, is that everybody are really looking for 4 freedoms, to have freedom in 4 areas of our lives. First, people want the freedom of time. They want to be able to do what they want to do when they want to do it. They want the freedom of money. They may not have to be a billionaire or a millionaire, but they want to be comfortable. They don't want to worry about freedom of money. Third is they want a freedom of mission, be able to work on their mission instead of somebody else's mission. And fourth is the freedom of relationship. They want to work with people they enjoy working with. So going back to that day, what I realized later that day and into the next several days is I did not have freedom of time. He was controlling my time. He wanted me to go to Michigan next week after I just survived a plane crash. I didn't have freedom of money because later they capped my money. And, and then my agreement, I signed the agreement, so it's up to me to read the agreement, right? So it's my fault. But, they capped my commissions because I made so much commissions. I didn't have freedom of mission. I was working for somebody else's mission, not my mission. And I didn't have freedom of relationships. I was working for someone who didn't even respect me. So I had to make the move. And that move actually started in 1997, shortly before my mentor passed away. And he told me something. And that's when all started coming back together. But it took a couple more years to figure it out.
So making these kinds of big life-changing decisions, a lot of people may feel that the uncertainty of making that kind of a decision is just too much. After that experience where you realized that, when you came that close to death, I think for me, having gone through my cancer journey and living through 9/11, it made the clarity of making those decisions a lot more, I guess, well-defined, because I started to realize that, okay, I was this close to meeting my maker, and it made me feel the urgency of, each day is a gift, and that I may not have tomorrow or next week or next month to be able to do some of the things that I really want to do. Do you feel like after that experience, you started to realize the urgency of making things in your life happen that you really wanted to do?
I agree with that because, I still had to make money, right? So I had to figure this game plan out and how to do it. But I tell you I tell you how it really went down. And it was, like I said, about 2 years later, 2011, 2012, somewhere in that area. I was still head of security for Tony. I was still working for the same company, and I was speaking on stages and raising money. So I was still doing all these things. So I was going 15 different directions. And I was in Chicago, Illinois, getting ready for what you just mentioned, a UPW event with Tony. And I had to go to a suite to get him ready to rock and roll, do his thing, right? And he brought me in the suite and told me he was going to go get another security director. And I said, why? What did I do? He said, no. Listen. He said, it's time for you to do this. He said, you've been working for these people way too long. One of the things that Tony would do when I picked him up, just a little insight on the background of how this whole thing works. When I would pick him up at the airport or the helipad or wherever, one of the first questions he'd ask me is, are you still working for that company? When are you going to step up and do it for yourself? So this day in Chicago, he said, he told me later, the reason he did that, because he knew the longer I stayed doing that, I would never be able to realize my vision and my dream. And that was one of the greatest gifts that anybody ever gave me. Because when I realized at that moment, Colin, he thought more about me than I thought about me. And I think that's what happens to a lot of people. Other people have more confidence than you have in yourself. And that was the impetus to make me move, make the move to do what I needed to do.
Well, that's why it's great to have, whether it's a coach or a mentor or a best friend, to just remind you of what you're capable of and to kick you in the butt when you need it. And you need it. You just sometimes need someone who can see that greatness within you.
Well, you got that fear of uncertainty, right? You have that fear of uncertainty.
Yeah.
What if, right? And I knew I could pull it off. The big uncertainty in my world was my wife lives on certainty. She loved the money. She loved the benefits. She had a lifestyle, right? So you're giving up certainty for this? Are you crazy? So what I had to do is actually sell her on, you will have as much certainty and have more certainty a few years from now once we sort of get this thing going. So she's never gone backwards. I had to give her certainty and that uncertainty. That was because I tell people, one of the things you learn going through a situation like this, and you probably learned it too, is the person with the most certainty in uncertain times, it is the leader. It doesn't matter if you're the CEO of the company or you're the person who's scrubbing floors at night. If you get people certainty in that uncertain time, people will look to you for leadership. So I always talk about, certainty is where you have to start with everything. You have to be certain in yourself first, so you get certainty to other people.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point in terms of when we discover what we really truly feel like we're destined to do in life. It's not always an easy decision, especially when we're talking about certainty. And if you got a family, if you have a wife, how was that conversation with your wife in terms of, honey, this is something that I know in my heart I really want to do, even though I may not know what this certainty looks like. What did that conversation look like? And from a sales perspective, whenever talking to someone and they say, well, I've got to talk to my wife or my husband about this decision, some of the things that we get trained in is asking or having that conversation and saying, well, if your husband or your wife were to say no to your dream, would this still stop you from going after what you really want to do? Or instead of asking for permission, you ask for support.
That's right.
What did that conversation look like for you and your wife?
That's exactly the direction I went. I didn't ask for permission. I knew I had to do it, and how it really went is I relayed the story of what happened the day after the plane crash, at the airport. Right when I realized that when I talked, I had seen her. Right, I had talked to her. So I got there. She told me that no one checked in with her from Oracle, and I knew at that moment I had to do something. But I relayed that story back to her. I said, what really, one of the things that's been sitting on my mind was they didn't even care enough to call you or me. What does that tell you? I mean, it's a great company. Listen, I work for a great company. It was certain people. Right? So you have to narrow it down. It wasn't the company. It was certain people and positions. But I told her, I said, and that's what I said. But the last couple of years, I've been really positioning myself to be able to do this. So I said, and I also said, you're not going to go backwards. I said, I promise. You still have the level of living you have. All right. I said, I may go backwards. We may not be taking those vacations like we used to, right? But you're not going backwards. And I everything will be supported. but this is the mission. And if you support me in this mission, 4 or 5 years from now, watch what happened. And that's exactly what happened. And she said, okay. She said, go for it. And it took me another few months, right? I mean, it took me a few years, Colin. This thing was not overnight.
Sure.
It took me a couple of years because I had to figure out the game plan. But
Right.
now one of the things I did is I figured out the game plan on how to do it. This is one of the things I teach people now when I coach them. How do you make that transition out? Because what I've realized, there's so many people who've been in the company 15, 20 years who've hit what I call halftime. And before Bob Buford wrote the book Halftime. And before he passed away, he invited me to Dallas. I got to sit with him for a day and get to hear his mind about this concept about halftime, where people get to that point where they're not growing anymore and they're frustrated. They've got the money, but they're not fulfilled. What do you do? So I figured out that game plan is when people get to halftime, which I was at halftime. I was growing. Money wasn't the issue, because I wasn't growing through my spirituality and everything else, my mission. So once you hit that threshold, right? It's like, okay, when you hit a threshold, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
You got to. So that's what happened. So it took me, like I said, about 3 years to figure that out, to get everything in place to make that move.
And in terms of putting all of this together and putting into place, you obviously had quite a few great mentors and moments leading up to the actual plane crash. In your TED Talk, you describe how you were the last person off the plane. And
last passenger. The captain was the last person, yes.
Okay. And as you described, as you hit the water and passengers were starting to climb out onto the wings, there wasn't enough room for everyone. And as you were walking up the aisle, you mentioned the plane was starting to fill up with water. And now, of course, it's frigid water. You said it was getting up to like knee deep, waist deep. And as you were walking through the aisle, you didn't know if you were stepping on bags or people. You didn't really necessarily know what was going on in that moment. And as you said, you walked through and finally got out onto the wing, and there wasn't a whole lot of room on the wing. You said you had to jump into the water and swim to a boat. Can you share a little bit about what that whole experience was like? What was going through your head, and what were you relying on to mentally get you through this whole experience at that point?
So thank you. So yes, once the plane was in the water, it was filling up quickly because the back end, someone tried to open up that back door, which unfortunately, I don't blame them, because they actually, that's what you hear, right? Go to the closest exit, which may be behind you. So I don't blame anybody, but that's why the water started coming in so quickly. So, my game plan, like I said, the way I managed my mind through those questions was I had to have a game plan. My game plan was aisle up out. I kept saying that in my head, aisle up out, aisle up out, aisle up out. So when that moment happened, it was ingrained in my body.
Sorry, say that again. What
aisle up out. Get to the aisle, get up and get out.
Up, out. Okay.
Yeah. So when I got to the aisle, my next game plan was to go up and then out. But that's the moment it changed. Because when I hit the aisle, I all of a sudden heard my mom start talking to me. My mom passed away in 1997, but there was something she would tell me when I was a child that I heard her say in my head. It was, if you do the right thing, God will take care of you. And I tell people, as I look back in that moment, my mom didn't tell me to do it. She says, if you do it. See, one of the greatest gifts my mother and father gave me, and my sister and brother, which I have failed miserably in my parenting, is my mother made me make choices when I was young and had consequences. So, I always grew up with, if you make a choice, you have it could be bad or good. So the consequence, when she said, if you do this, God will take care of you, my thought was, take care of other people first. That's why I climbed over the seats towards the back of the plane to see if anybody needed help. Because I knew I was all right. I didn't know if anybody in the back was all right. So I got to the back, and it was about chest level deep water, and I got behind the last person. And like you framed it very well, it was New York, winter, late afternoon. So it's dark in the back of the plane, right? So as you were walking out, you started moving, you hitting things, you started stepping on things, you started trying climbing over. And the first light that I saw was on the right side of the plane at 10F. And I'm like, I'm out of here. So I start climbing out the door, and all of a sudden I look up, and as you mentioned, the wing was already filled up. The boat was already filled up. So that's why I was inside the plane waist deep in 36-degree water for 7 minutes holding on the lifeboat, because there's no room on the wing of the boat. I never got on the wing, never got on the lifeboat. But there was a moment that happened approximately 6 or 7 minutes later, after all this commotion was going on. There's a lot of things happening. I felt the plane shift. And I found out later, because I get to talk to everybody, is one of the people who were part of the rescue. He had a tugboat, and as he was backing it out, he hit the front of the plane. When he hit the front of the plane, it shook the plane. It shook the plane. That's when I felt water for the first time going up my back. I'm like, man, this thing's going down like Titanic. This sucker's going down. I got to get out of here. And that's when I always take my mom and dad for giving me swimming lessons, because that's the moment I had to jump in and swim to save my life to the closest boat I could find, which had to be into that wing.
And you mentioned as you swam to the nearest boat, there were some guys in the boat, and you said to this day you still don't know who those men are, but you put one arm up and then the other arm up, and they literally dragged you out of the water into the boat. I think that's the hand of God reaching down to you after you decided at row 15 to, after a plane crash, to go to all the way to the back of the plane to make sure everyone got out. Man, Dave, that's just an incredible decision to make, not knowing that, first surviving the crash and then not knowing whether or not you were going to survive, the sinking of the airplane, but to jump out and then have those guys rescue you. And then you mentioned that you were in the hospital for a little bit, and then that's when all the interviews and the requests, I saw Katie Couric speaking about you, and what was that like, all that attention, and what were you what was going through your head after the first few days after the crash?
I had never been around media before. I mean, I was around media with Tony, but that was his media, right? All I did was sort of manage stuff. But when you got 20 reporters in your face, and a little secret about that picture of me in the hospital, which is shown all the time, I had nothing on underneath it. All that is a hot air bag flowing hot air up and down. I had nothing on. So my agreement with Katie Couric was, I do not want to go on camera, right? I said, I'll do it. I don't want to go on camera, because the guy next to me was actually doing Diane Sawyer with ABC at the same time I was doing Katie Couric.
Wow.
I mean, it was going hot and heavy. And I mean, I was talking to everybody, and, that next day when I got to LaGuardia, I told them I didn't really want to do any interviews, but I did one quick interview before I went in, because they were already out there, right, waiting for me. And when I got back, I had interviews and, People Magazine and local channels and all that. And so for the next at least 6 weeks, I was doing interviews every day, somewhere around the world. And so I became very astute on how to do interviews. And one of the best investments I made is get a PR person to help me understand how to really work with this. Because you being in the media, it's you never know what they're going to ask, and how they're going to approach it. And so I was very honored to do it, but it was a mad rush, as you could tell. I mean, you got to remember, this is one of the things I started preparing for. This is the busiest city in the world at rush hour, right? At rush hour. And all this is coming together, and there's only 2 people in the hospital, Barry and I. So they couldn't find everybody else, because they were already someplace else and going home. They could find us. So Barry and I were on every TV show in the world almost that next day, that evening. So that's how both of our names got out so quickly, because they could find us. They couldn't find everybody else, so they got home and do their local stuff, right? So.
And can you share with us a little bit about what the PR agent told you in terms of how to craft the message and what it is that they're going to ask you? Tell us a little bit about that.
She, my PR person still to this day is Rania, and I look at her as part of my family, because she really helped mold me on how to do these things. And she just, one of the things she always recommends is answer the question you want to answer, right? They'll ask you a question off the side, you're like, where's that coming from? And answer what you want to answer. So, but I always try to answer honestly in everything that I do. And, I remember one interview from Montreal, Quebec, and it was right after the plane that crashed at Buffalo. Montreal is fairly close to Buffalo. And I was, at that point in time, I was doing interviews. Whenever there was a transportation incident, they would call me as a passenger, right? Say, what are you going through? What's going through your mind? And that just happened. Well, what they didn't know is I had a client on that plane, and she passed away. So when I was doing this interview, Colin, and this is where when I started bringing in somebody else, because I was not ready for this. He asked me, well, why do you think those folks on that plane died and you lived? And I was shocked. I was like, I wasn't ready for that. I'm like, it just wasn't my time. That's all I could come up with. But it was truthful. It just wasn't my time, right? And God gave me a different mission, and I'm taking advantage of that mission. So so the media, That's why I always encourage them. One of the things I do when I coach people and I help people get on stage, one of the things we do is I give them media training. I give them somebody who can teach them how to handle these situations. Because, as you know, if you get a book and you're doing TV interviews or radio interviews, you got to be ready. And a lot of these people think they can just go on and answer questions. Well, we've seen lately, right? They can take it any way they want to take it.
Oh, yeah. And practice and rehearsal definitely helps just to acclimate yourself to the speed and just the limelight like that. But in terms of the few days after the crash and thinking about the message, did you feel that now this was something that you were like, okay, now I need to think about what am I going to do with all of this? Do I want to turn this into what it is right now, where you're now speaking all over the world and you've raised over $14 million for the Red Cross and you have your own magazine? Those few days afterwards, was this vision of what you're living right now really something you started to think about, or did this kind of evolve over time?
It wasn't a thought. I tell you when it became a thought and then became the mission and turned into the mission. It was the following Sunday, approximately 10 days later, when I was asked to speak at my church, and they asked me to speak for a thing called men's breakfast. Now, I don't know anybody else's church, but men's breakfast at our church is about 40, 50 old guys eating pancakes, right? So I'm like, I can handle this, right? I can handle this.
Yep.
So, they asked me that the week before. The week before was 3 days after a plane crash. I said, sure, of course. I was at church. It's my time. So, yeah. And I spoke, and, all of a sudden, I didn't know they advertised it, Colin, all over Charlotte, and 400 or 500 people show up. And I started to freak out. I'm like, I wasn't expecting this. So I go behind the door and the curtain where they had this thing. But I actually moved it to our gym, right? Because it's so big. And I said, God, give me something to say, man. Just give it to me now. Deliver. Just give me something to say, right? Because I hadn't practiced anything. Because I was on every meet. I was doing this everything, right? So I do whatever I said that day. And I get done speaking. And a couple of men wanted to talk to me. One was from Bank of America and one was from Wachovia. They had people on the plane with me. So I'm cool with that, right? I mean, they have people at times, but I look up in the back of the room. You got sort of envision this. This is a gym, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm at one end. I look up and I see this older lady in the back, like looking at us, staring at me. Didn't think anything of it. I'm talking to these two gentlemen. All of a sudden, she takes our left, comes all the way around, comes in and interrupts this conversation, just walks in on it and grabs my left arm really tight. And I jump because, I just been through a plane crash and I'm getting pulled and tugged. I'm like, what's she going to do to me, right? But then she looked me in the eye and said something that changed everything. She said, I was questioning if there's a God. I don't believe in miracles. But you are physical evidence there is a God and he does miracles. Thank you. Thank you. She looked at me one more time, let my arm go, and walked away. And I looked at these two gentlemen and they were crying, physically bawling right there in the middle of it. And I'm like looking around like, what just happened? Mm-hmm. But my minister was behind me witnessing this whole thing. I looked at him like, what's going on? And that's the moment I realized what happened to me on January 15, 2009, it impacted somebody. Before she goes to her great beyond, wherever that is, now believes there is a God who does miracles because I am physical evidence. And that was the moment I realized this is the time, to fulfill the mission. This is it. God has given me another mission. I have to fulfill it now.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about the concept of post-traumatic growth syndrome.
I had never heard that term. I was sitting exactly where I'm sitting right now. I get a phone call from a gentleman that said he wanted to do an article in AARP magazine on me. I'm like, what can I offer all these old people, right? I mean, AARP's for all these old people. I mean, at that time I think I was 52, maybe 53, somewhere around there. I forget. And he goes, listen, yeah, you're experiencing something called post-traumatic growth syndrome. I said, what the heck's that? He said, a lot of people go through PTSD. I said, I know what that is. And he said, we want to talk to you about how did you grow from the situation instead of going into depression, where so many other people went into a depressed state. Mm-hmm. He said, that's interesting. And I did this interview for AARP. And all of a sudden I started getting a request about, how did you grow? And I shared some strategy on how I grew. And that's what my TED Talk became about. Because I put this out to a TED Talk. I got 10 requests out of that. And they wanted my TED Talk because no one ever talked about this topic. And that's, Colin, why I did my TED Talk. I did it in Canada because the suicide rate was out of control. And I wanted to be able to get this message out in a bigger way. So that's why I did it in Kingston, Ontario, so I could get this out in a bigger way. So it's about how do you grow from a traumatic life event? And what did I do differently than everybody else? what did I do differently? And there were certain things I did differently. And one of the things is something I learned from Tony. I mean, it was pretty basic, but have you ever been to a UPW like you said you have? He talks about this. It's like, when you got something in your body, what happens is if you don't get it out, it stacks to a point where you can't get out. It's so deep in your body and your head. So the way first thing I did is I spoke and got it out of my body. A lot of people from that day still haven't talked about it. And they don't want to, and I don't blame them. They can do whatever they want. That's their choice. But the first thing I did was get it out of my body by speaking. So the more I spoke, the more I got out of my body. The second thing I did and I realized this when I was in the green room of Good Morning America. Several passengers and I and the crew were on Good Morning America. Yeah, we did this show. And there was a gentleman who was a passenger who started just getting very vocal, got emotional. And he said he never wanted to see us again. He stormed out. And all I started going, what's wrong with this guy? I mean, we survived a plane crash. We got, we're on Good Morning America. I mean, how bad can it get? But then what I realized later, what I found out later, he was going through a divorce and he just lost his job. So the meaning he attached to the plane crash was devastation. The meaning I attached was it was a blessing because it gave me a chance to fulfill my mission. Same situation, two different meanings. So the meaning you attach to something produces whatever emotion you're in. Emotion's your life.
Yeah.
That's two of the things that I learned, I talked about, and I shared in my TED Talk.
Amazing. So do you feel that you experienced any post-traumatic stress syndrome from this? And because I know after 9/11, I had to go see a therapist. My nerves were shot. And just, that was the first time I went to speak to a therapist, and it really helped talking through this and just having someone ask questions. And what I didn't realize was that I was holding in a lot of this emotion that was just buried down there. Just having someone ask me some of these questions in a safe environment, I just, without realizing it, I just would break down. And I think it was incredibly healing to be able to just have a place for me to share and talk about some of the stuff. Did therapy, was that a part of your healing journey, or was it strictly just being on stage and telling your story?
Thank you for the question, because one of the great things US Airways did for all of us is offer us therapy, paid therapy to be able to do this. I did not take advantage of that. I know several people that did. I did not. But it's interesting what you just said, because I was on a Christian Broadcasting Network show several years ago in San Antonio, Texas, and they had myself and a gentleman who survived 9/11 on same time, because they wanted to really hear the story, right? And is there any similarities or differences? And that gentleman survived 9/11 like you did, but he did have therapy. He wasn't challenged. And then I was sharing my story, which I just shared with you, about how I got it out and the meaning and everything else. And it was amazing. It was an amazing interview, because people got to hear two situations where everybody remembers where they were on those two situations, and two ways that you could handle it. And yes, he needed therapy and he survived. I applaud him. But I also talked about the power of faith and how that had a lot to do with it too, because I knew something bigger was out there for me. So the meaning I attached was a blessing, right? So I never did therapy. I never did have to do therapy, but I think the best thing I did was that next weekend get it out of my body. And if somebody responded, and I realized that's why I'm survived. This is why I'm here. God gave me another direction. And some people have got on my case for doing what I do. I talk about passengers, and for a time, Colin, I got sort of like upset. I'm like, why are they criticizing me for doing this?
Sure.
But then I realized, you know what? I said, we all had the same opportunity. The difference is I took action and you didn't. That's the only difference. You could do the same thing I'm doing, but you haven't. So, that came to realization when I was on Oprah. I was invited to be on Oprah with several other passengers in the crew, right? Very cool experience. And you find if you're a guy on Oprah, you're really not, you're not the highlight, right? I mean, and I was there the day before Oprah's greatest gifts or best gifts. I missed the thing by one day, but I digress. But what I found out when I was there is several passengers who were passengers on the plane, were on the show, still hadn't got back on the plane. I talked to one person who took the train from New York to get there because she would never get back on a plane again.
Wow.
And that's when I realized they hadn't gotten out of their body yet. They hadn't handled it yet, right? So, when I did it, I swam with Navy SEALs and special operations over the last 4 years raising money. But the second year I did it, I was interviewed by ABC in New York. And one of the things I talked to them was about that is if you don't handle it very quick, it's still ingrained in your body, and it'll stack to the point where you may never be able to recover from it. And that's what I said that on ABC on that interview. I think it was 2022 in August. If you want to go back and check it out, it was a great interview because I actually talked about this subject we're talking about right here.
Wow, so important to to be able to share and talk and let it out. It's definitely important. It's made a huge difference in my life, and talking about these experiences and this is why I feel it's important to talk about my cancer journey and sharing this. It's been very healing for me. In terms of what you're doing now and getting up onto stages all over the world, what would you say is your message? How did you craft that message, and has it changed or evolved over the past few years now that you are also helping raise money for Red Cross? And you mentioned you swim with the Navy SEALs. Is that for the Red Cross as well?
No, that's for their fun, because one of the biggest challenges we have right now is the suicide rate for people transitioning out of the military is 23 a day. And when I found that out, I was appalled.
That's
insane. I was like, this cannot be, especially for our heroes. So that's why I started raising money, raise awareness for the first 2 years with Navy SEALs back in the Hudson River, which is a part of my story about how to face your fear going back to where you almost died. So that's a part of my story. But the last 2 years I've done it for special operations who are now transitioning out because they've fallen on hard times. And they're like, I'm raising money for that. I've raised money for that. So that's why I've done that. So, how I started getting on stages because, and I just used a strategy that I learned years ago from a guy named Zig Ziglar. I don't know if anybody remember Zig Ziglar. He was Tony Robbins before he was Tony Robbins, right? So, but the way Zig Ziglar became Zig Ziglar is he did his first 70 plus events free. He just because he wanted to practice his technique and perfect his performance. So I used first 50 to 60 events. I didn't take any money. I was just giving. But that allowed me to hone my message. And the first several years was about the plane crash. We wanted to hear about that. So that was the story. And then I evolved to another stage about, okay, what did you learn from that? Right. And now it's about how do you really apply that and use that to be able to find these four freedoms and use an experience to be able to have freedom and how to grow and evolve and how to be able to get what I call about get clear, get free, get going. How do you transform your life? So it's definitely evolved over the last several years, from the plane crash to the lessons to how do you transform, and giving those lessons on how you can transform your life through a traumatic or a challenging event.
How many stages do you think you've spoken on?
Over 1,800. We stopped counting at 1,800.
1,800.
Yeah.
Wow. And it's cool to hear that your story has evolved over that time period. And for some of my listeners who are speakers, who are looking to get up onto stages, what's some advice you would share with them in terms of how to craft a powerful message and thinking about their audience? When you talk about putting together like your TED Talk, do you focus on the audience first, or do you focus on you and what you're passionate about, what your message is? And what's your strategy for putting together a good talk?
Well, thanks for that question, because at first it was just a story. So I had my story, right? And then, but you start learning things, right? And you learn, what does the audience really want? See, because I think everybody's got a story, and that's why I wrote my book, Moments Matter. My first book I wrote myself was Moments Matter, because what I believe is every moment in your life is there for a reason and purpose, and it'll serve you. That's my belief system. So everybody's got moments in their life that are there for a reason. So everybody's got a story. The thing is, the greatest speakers are the ones who can tell the story the greatest and leave a lesson, right? And what has this done for you, and what can it do for you? So when I coach and help people, I really start talking about let's find out connect to your core. What is that centralized message you want to get out? Because most people come to me. I'm working with somebody right now who says, I'm putting a book out. I want to get on stages, and that's great. But you don't have to have a book. I didn't have a book to get on stages. I had a message and a story about survival and inspiration. So I think, I tell people, let's connect to the core. What is your story? What is your core story? And start building stories around that story. and be able to also back up your stories. See, a lot of people will tell stories that, they can't back up. One of the things that, we pride ourselves on in my little team is everything we talk about, everything you read, I've actually experienced. So that actually came to light to me. I mean, I knew it, underneath, but I was actually in an event in Orlando, Florida, and I was talking to a lady who was going on stage. I wasn't going to be on stage. I was going there just to hear people about leadership. And she and I were talking about it because I talk about leadership likewise, right? It's, part of, part of my message, especially right now. And I asked her, I said, well, how did you get your content? How did you really come about understanding of being on this stage, talk about leadership, which was because I read every book, I got every theory down, I know exactly, the leadership strategies. And she goes, well, how did you learn? I said, I actually experienced it. I actually had to step up and do it. And that's when I realized there's a lot of people who are tremendous speakers who have theories and read the books and got it, and they're eloquent. But I'm always looking for someone who's walked their talk. And that's what Tony taught me years ago. You got to be able to walk your talk. And if I can't walk my talk, I don't share something. So I tell one of the things I share with people when I coach them and help them get on stages is, everything we talk about, you better be able to back it up, right? We're not going to tell a story just to tell a story. We're going to tell a story to be able to help people, somebody else live their experience or help them in their life.
Yeah, the credibility factor is obviously incredibly important. And in terms of all this experience on your stage, the stages that you've spoken on, you've now turned all of this into your magazine, Moments Matter. Tell us a little bit about what was the impetus and the reason why you created the magazine and what's your goal with it.
Thank you. I never thought that I'd do a magazine, Colin. I was at our mutual friends event, Leo Woodford, a few years ago. And she came up and she goes, you need a magazine. I said, I'm not Joanna Gaines. I'm not Oprah. Who am I to have a magazine, right? I mean, I'm just Dave, right? She goes, listen, you don't understand. You're not only your message, but you can help other people get their messages out about their key moments. I said, okay, I'll try it, right? I'll try it. So I did the first 2 issues, and basically it was all my stories, right? But basically me just writing. And I realized people were liking to hear about how these moments came together for me. So on the 3rd issue, I changed the strategy. I said, you know what? I'm going to share other people's stories on how their moments. And I started doing that, and all of a sudden, I started getting people, amazing people, who I wanted to have them to share their story, because a lot of these people were just ordinary people, but they had an extraordinary story that got them where they're at. I mean, the one that really helped take this thing off, I'll be very candid, was 2 springs ago when I had a lady by the name of Amy Porterfield on the cover. And, I don't know if anybody knows who Amy Porterfield is. I've known her for several years. Amy was actually a creative director for Tony Robbins. So I knew she and I traveled the world together doing stuff, right? So I knew Amy, but Amy was shy. And, Amy had that job, but she had her Moments Matter moment and realized she could help other people build online businesses. Because that was she knew how to be creative and how to write it, right? So now from that point to this point, now she's revenued over $100 million and with the top female, not the top female in the United States, on teaching how to be an online business. I wanted people to tell her story because you don't have to be a rock star, but if you've been able to impact somebody's life, I want to get that story out. So I'm excited to have you in my magazine here coming up in the next several months, because it's, everybody needs to hear these stories.
Would love that.
I'm excited for people to understand everybody's got a story.
Yeah.
Which hopefully will lead into helping them get on stage or whatever the heck they want to do. So,
well, I'd be honored to be in your magazine, Dave, and it's been an honor having this conversation with you. Tell us how people can get in touch with you and what it is that you do to support others. You said you do some coaching and some speaking training. Tell us a little bit about how you serve others.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm honored to be able to do that. The best way to get in touch with me is if you go to LinkedIn, Dave Sanderson, LinkedIn, you'll find me every week. I put out new content. Today we just put out some new content because I want people to understand this is you evolve, right? You learn things, right? And you put pieces together. So Dave Sanderson Speaks is a way you can also get a copy of the magazine, a complimentary digital copy of the magazine. And I do coach people. I coach people primarily who are entrepreneurs and or salespeople who are hit that halftime. At that moment, it's like, I'm not growing anymore. How do you transform and help them make their transformational moment? And I also, I've been showing people how to get on stages through a strategy I call, speak to scale. So I put together a program about how to speak to scale your business. So it's amazing because I'm now talking to people or writing books and doing things, but they don't understand the strategy on how to do it. And all I do is take what I've learned basically and show them how to do it and make sure they can get it done in a timely fashion. So, which as you may have heard Tony say, and I copy this, came from Tony Robbins, this is not mine, how to compress decades into days. Usually takes people decades to do, get it down to how to get it done right now.
Beautiful. And the last question I like to ask my guests before we jump off here, and thanks again, Dave, for your time and your insight and your generosity. I like to ask the question, who or what inspires you? And I think what inspired me about your talk was something that you mentioned that your mom always told you, and that, or would mention to you in terms of the phrase, I can't.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about how that has inspired you throughout your life?
Yeah, thank you. My mother, when you grew up in our house and you ever said I can't, and my mom said, if you can't do it, you're going to do it. And after she passed away in 1997, when I realized that was her worldview. See, the quickest transformation is change two things: change your worldview and the conditions you're living in right now. Those are the two quickest ways. I teach that. But her worldview is, if you can't, you must. So whenever I got pushed to a point where, it's like, I don't know if I could do this or not, it always comes back. That day that day when I put my arms up, I kept saying to myself, I can't, how am I going to get my arms up? I can't do it. And all of a sudden, if you can't, you got to do it. So that one phrase from my mother, it still lives with me to this day, because I believe that is the key. The people you see succeed have that perseverance, right? They don't give up. They don't see "can" as a word. So I taught this to our kids. Hopefully my kids are doing it likewise. And I know that it's a challenge because of the peer environment. All they hear is "can't." And that's one of the reasons, I'll leave you this, why I went back in the Hudson River. And so I wanted to show people, if you can't, your mindset is, if you can't do it, of course you're not going to be able to do it. That's your mindset. I want to show people how to face your fears. I did want to raise money for the cause, most definitely, but also, how do you go back to a place that almost took your life? I can't do that, but if you can't, you must. You have to do it. So through that experience now 4 times, I show people, that word is not existent. You can do anything you put your mind to, but you have to have a strategy, right? It all comes down to the strategy. And so if you can compress everything down, what I do is I help people find strategies, because one thing I've learned through my life, Colin, if you have a strategy, you can get anything accomplished.
Love it. Beautiful. And if anyone is looking for some help with their strategy, I would highly encourage you to reach out to Dave. Again, you can follow him on Instagram at Dave Sanderson Speaks, and you can check him out at his website, davesandersonspeaks.com. Dave, thanks so much for being here again. Look forward to collaborating with you. I would love to help you help support all the amazing charitable work that you're doing, and look forward to creating some great things together.
Thank you very much, Colin. God bless.
All right. Thank you.